The quiet panic. You know that feeling when you're deep underground and the world above feels like a distant memory? That suffocating weight pressing down on you from every direction? Well, I'm about to share with you the most terrifying experience of my entire life. And trust me, after 23 years working in the mines, I thought I'd seen everything. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened in Shaft 7 of the Blackrock Mining Complex. This story takes place 3 months ago, during what should have been a routine extraction operation. I was working the night shift with my crew just like any other Tuesday in October. The mine was old, built back in the 1940s, but it had always been reliable. Sure, we'd hear the occasional groaning of the support beams and feel the mountains settling around us, but that was normal. That was just the mine talking to us, as we used to say. My name is Marcus, and I've been a miner since I was 19 years old. Started right out of high school when my dad got me the job. He worked these same tunnels for 35 years before retiring, and his father before him. Mining was in our blood, you could say. I knew every inch of those tunnels like the back of my hand. Every sound the mountain made, every vibration through the rock, every shift in the air pressure. I could read that mine like a book. The crew that night consisted of 5 of us. There was Tommy, our shift supervisor, who'd been working longer than any of us. Jake and Peterson, 2 solid guys who never complained about the work. Then there was Rodriguez, the new kid who'd only been with us for about 6 months. And me. We were tasked with clearing a blockage in one of the deeper shafts about 800 feet down from the main entrance. Everything started normal enough. We took the cage elevator down, our headlamps cutting through the darkness as we descended into the belly of the mountain. The familiar smell of damp earth and metal filled our nostrils. Our equipment rattled and clanged as the elevator dropped deeper and deeper. Rodriguez looked a little nervous, like he always did on these deeper runs, but that was expected. The kid still wasn't completely comfortable being that far underground. When we reached our level, Tommy checked his clipboard and pointed down the main tunnel. Shaft 7 was about a quarter-mile walk through the primary corridor. We grabbed our gear and started the trek, our boots echoing off the tunnel walls. The air was thick and humid, just like always. Our headlamps created dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls as we walked. About halfway to our destination, Peterson stopped and held up his hand. We all froze, listening. There was a sound coming from somewhere ahead of us, a low rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Tommy frowned and checked his radio, but it was just static. Communication was always spotty this deep in the mine. The rumbling stopped as suddenly as it had started. Tommy shrugged and motioned for us to keep moving. These old mines made all kinds of noises, and we'd learned to distinguish between the harmless settling sounds and the ones that meant real trouble. This seemed like the former, so we continued on our way. When we finally reached Shaft 7, I immediately noticed something was off. The air felt different somehow, heavier and more oppressive than usual. There was also a strange smell, something I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the typical mine smell of earth and moisture. This was something else, something organic and unpleasant. Tommy directed us to set up our equipment near the blocked section. A cave-in had occurred sometime during the previous week, and our job was to clear the debris and reinforce the tunnel walls. It was standard procedure, something we'd done hundreds of times before. We positioned our pneumatic drills and started breaking up the larger rocks. The work was going smoothly for the first hour. We'd managed to clear about half of the blockage when Rodriguez called out that he was hearing something strange. We shut off our equipment and listened. At first, there was nothing but the usual silence of the deep mine. Then faintly, we heard it too. It sounded like scratching, like fingernails dragging across stone, coming from somewhere behind the remaining debris. Jake laughed nervously and said it was probably just rats. Mines always had rats, and they could make all sorts of weird noises when they got trapped in small spaces. Tommy nodded in agreement, but I could see the concern in his eyes. In all my years underground, I'd never heard rats make a sound quite like that. We resumed our work, but the scratching continued, growing louder and more persistent. It seemed to be coming from multiple directions now, as if whatever was making the noise was moving around behind the blocked section. Rodriguez was getting visibly agitated, constantly looking over his shoulder and jumping at every little sound. Then Peterson made a discovery that changed everything. While clearing debris from the lower section of the blockage, his drill bit broke through into what appeared to be a small cavity. Air rushed out of the hole with a whooshing sound, carrying with it that strange organic smell we'd noticed earlier, but much stronger now. It was nauseating, like rotting meat mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Tommy immediately ordered us to stop work and back away from the area. He approached the hole carefully and shined his flashlight into it. What he saw made him stumble backward, his face pale even in the dim light of our headlamps. When we asked him what was in there, he just shook his head and said we needed to get out of the shaft immediately. But as we started gathering our equipment, that's when we heard it. A sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. It was like screaming, but not quite human. High-pitched and agonized, coming from the cavity Peterson had broken into. The sound echoed through the tunnel, seeming to bounce off every surface and grow louder with each repetition. Rodriguez dropped his drill and started running toward the main tunnel. Tommy shouted for him to wait, but the kid was already disappearing into the darkness beyond our lights. That's when we heard the first rumble from above us. Small pieces of rock and dust began falling from the ceiling, and the support beam started groaning under increasing pressure. Jake grabbed my arm and yelled that we needed to move now. The mountain was starting to shift, and we could all feel it. The floor beneath our feet began to vibrate, and the screaming from the cavity grew even louder, joined now by what sounded like multiple voices, all crying out in that same inhuman way. We ran toward the main tunnel, our equipment abandoned behind us. The rumbling was getting worse, and larger chunks of rock were falling around us. Our headlamps bounced wildly as we ran, creating a chaotic light show on the tunnel walls. Behind us, the screaming continued, but now it seemed to be following us, getting closer. That's when the first major collapse happened. A section of the tunnel ceiling about 50 feet behind us came crashing down with a thunderous roar, completely blocking our path back to Shaft 7. The impact knocked us all to the ground, and for a moment everything was silent except for the settling of debris. We picked ourselves up and continued toward the main tunnel, but our relief was short-lived. As we rounded the next corner, we could see that our path to the elevator was blocked. Another collapse had sealed off the main corridor, trapping us in this section of the mine. The screaming had stopped, but now we could hear something else. Something moving through the tunnels behind us, getting closer. Tommy's radio crackled to life with static, but we couldn't make out any coherent words from the surface. We were completely cut off, trapped between two cave-ins with whatever was making those sounds somewhere in the darkness behind us. The beam from my headlamp was starting to dim, and I could see the others checking their equipment with growing concern. Peterson found a small alcove where we could regroup and assess our situation. We had maybe 6 hours of lamp battery life left, limited water, and no way to communicate with the surface. Worse yet, the air was starting to feel stale, which meant our oxygen supply was being cut off by the collapses. That's when Jake pointed to something that made my blood run cold. There were marks on the tunnel wall near where we'd stopped, scratches gouged deep into the solid rock. They looked almost like claw marks, but they were far too large to have been made by any animal I knew of. The scratches formed strange patterns, almost like symbols or writing in some unknown language. Rodriguez's voice echoed from somewhere ahead of us in the tunnel. He was calling for help, but his voice sounded strange, distorted somehow. Tommy shouted back, asking where he was, but Rodriguez's response was just more of that inhuman screaming we'd heard earlier. Whatever had gotten to him, it wasn't good. We pressed forward through the tunnel, following the sound of Rodriguez's voice. The scratches on the walls became more frequent and elaborate as we moved deeper. Some of them were fresh, as if they'd been carved just moments before we arrived. The organic smell was getting stronger too, that nauseating mixture of decay and something else I still couldn't identify. The tunnel began to slope downward, taking us even deeper into the mountain than we'd ever been before. This section wasn't on any of the mine maps I'd studied. It was like we'd broken through into some natural cave system that had been hidden behind the rockfall. The walls here were different too, smoother and more organic looking, as if they'd been carved by water over thousands of years. Tommy's headlamp suddenly illuminated something ahead of us that stopped us all in our tracks. It was Rodriguez, or what was left of him. He was standing with his back to us, perfectly still, about 30 feet down the tunnel. But something was wrong with his silhouette. His arms seemed too long and his head was tilted at an unnatural angle. When Tommy called out to him, Rodriguez slowly turned around. What we saw in the beam of our headlamps will haunt me for the rest of my life. His face was gone, replaced by something else entirely. Where his features should have been, there was just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over bone. But the worst part was his eyes. They were still human, still Rodriguez's eyes, and they were filled with absolute terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of words, that same inhuman screaming poured out. The sound reverberated through the tunnel, and as it did, we heard answering calls from multiple directions around us. We weren't alone down here. There were others, and they were all around us. Jake grabbed my shoulder and pointed to the walls. The scratch marks were moving, shifting, and changing before our eyes. The symbols were rearranging themselves into new patterns, and I swear I could almost understand what they were trying to say. It was like they were alive, trying to communicate with us or warn us about something terrible that was coming. That's when the mountain started shaking again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the random settling of rock and earth. This was rhythmic, purposeful, like something massive was moving through the tunnels around us. The vibrations grew stronger and more frequent, and dust and small rocks began falling from the ceiling again. Peterson whispered that we needed to find another way out. But when we turned around, the tunnel behind us had changed. The walls were closer together now, and the ceiling was lower. It was like the mountain itself was closing in on us, trying to crush us or keep us trapped down here forever. The thing that had been Rodriguez started walking toward us, its movements jerky and unnatural. With each step, more of those creatures appeared from side tunnels and crevices in the walls. They all had that same smooth, featureless appearance, but their eyes were human eyes filled with recognition and terror. These had been miners once, workers who'd gotten trapped down here and been changed into something else. Tommy pulled out his emergency flare and lit it, bathing the tunnel in red light. The creatures recoiled from the brightness, giving us a moment to see our surroundings more clearly. The tunnel walls were covered in those moving symbols, and they seemed to pulse and writhe in the flare's glow. At the far end of the tunnel, I could make out what looked like a massive opening, a cavern that stretched beyond the reach of our lights. We ran toward that opening, the creatures following behind us with their inhuman cries echoing off the walls. The flare was burning down quickly, and I knew we only had minutes before we'd be plunged back into darkness. As we reached the cavern entrance, I looked back one last time and saw something that defied all logic and reason. The tunnel we'd just escaped from was sealing itself up, the walls flowing together like liquid stone. The creatures were being absorbed back into the rock, their terrified human eyes the last thing to disappear. Whatever force controlled this place was done with us for now. But I had the feeling it wasn't finished with us permanently. The cavern was enormous, stretching far beyond what our remaining lights could illuminate. But in the distance, I could see a faint glow that looked like artificial light. Emergency lighting from some other section of the mine maybe, or rescue equipment from a search team. We stumbled toward it, exhausted and terrified, praying it would lead us back to the surface. It took us 4 hours to reach that light, and when we finally did, we found ourselves at an old maintenance shaft that led to the surface. The emergency ladder was rusted and dangerous, but it was our only way out. One by one, we climbed that ladder, leaving the nightmare behind us in the depths of the mountain. When we finally emerged into the cold night air, the rescue teams were waiting for us. They'd been searching for over 8 hours since the collapses were detected. We tried to tell them about what we'd seen down there, about Rodriguez and the creatures and the moving symbols on the walls. But when they sent teams back down to investigate, they found nothing but solid rock where the tunnels had been. The official report listed Rodriguez as missing, presumed dead in the cave-in. The mine was permanently sealed, and the company cited structural instability as the reason. But I know the truth. I know there's something down there in the darkness. Something that feeds on trapped miners and turns them into those smooth-faced horrors we encountered. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that scratching sound like fingernails on stone, and I wonder if Rodriguez is still down there, trapped in that nightmare, waiting for the next group of miners to break through and join him in the depths. The mountain remembers everything, and it's always hungry for more. That's why I'm telling you this story. Because if you ever find yourself working in an old mine, and you hear scratching behind the walls and you smell that organic decay in the air, you need to get out immediately. Don't be curious, don't investigate. Just run, because some places underground were never meant to be disturbed, and some things are better left buried in the darkness where they belong.